Hello and welcome to this training session. My name is Dr. Evan Hoffman. I'm a peace building and conflict resolution expert with over 15 years of experience and an instructor for Brāv. Today our session is on everyday conflict prevention and resolution. This is one of 4 online courses that I'm delivering for Brāv, for the Brave ones. The other 3 courses are peace leadership skills, preventing youth violence, power, anger, and assertiveness. So this is the first in a series of 4 trainings that will always be delivered on Saturdays at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So if you enjoy today's training, sign up for the next 3 that will follow consecutively. So the next one after this, like I mentioned before, is peace leadership skills, and then preventing youth violence, and then power, anger, and assertiveness. So the intent with these trainings then is that you should have formally registered with Brāv to take the training, and at the end of this webinar, and by the way, I'm thinking that we're going to run about an hour today, just so you're aware of that. At the end of this webinar, there's a short quiz that you have to complete. Don't worry, it's not too difficult or onerous, but really the purpose of the quiz is to ensure that you watched and participated in the entire video, in the whole webinar, and that you understood the main ideas and you're prepared to apply them as a Brave one when you use the Brave platform for helping other people manage their conflicts. So we'll get to that eventually, don't worry about it right now, but there is a quiz that we'll look at. So if you haven't already done so, then please go ahead and officially register for this course and pay the registration fee, and then upon that will allow you to submit the quiz, and then upon successful completion of the quiz, this course will be added to your Brave One profile, so that other people searching for your services will see that you've now taken training in everyday conflict prevention and resolution. So again, welcome, and let's move along here. So it's my pleasure to deliver this course, to share my knowledge and experience with you. And like I mentioned, I've been working in the field of conflict prevention and conflict resolution and conflict management for over 15 years now in various different contexts around the world. And so our aim for today is to go over some practical and applied tips that you can use right away in your own life to prevent and resolve the conflicts that you're currently facing. And I would add to that, and to assist others as a Brave one, to assist them to prevent and resolve the conflicts they are facing. So without any further ado then, let's get started here. This is to help orient you to the topics that we're going to cover the next little while. And so really what I'm hoping to achieve here is to go over 3 major topics. First of all, I want to take a look at the conflict life cycle, and this is a diagram that's going to assist you to visualize conflicts and try to diagnose how serious they are, whether they are escalating, and how quickly they're escalating. So part of that, the second part of that, is to recognize the signs of rising tensions. So different conflicts are going to have different indicators that the tensions are rising. So we'll talk about that. That'll be the first topic we're going to cover. The second topic that I want to look at covers 9 golden rules for conflict prevention. So in the first case, we're saying we have to be aware that conflicts go through certain predictable phases where they escalate and so on. But then the second part of that is we have to know, well, if there is a conflict and it's starting to escalate, what can we do in practical terms to help to prevent the conflicts from getting more serious or becoming violent, perhaps? Pardon me. So that's the 9 golden rules for conflict prevention. Thirdly, and this is a huge part of preventing conflicts, is we're going to look at the importance of communication and how to improve communication in conflict settings. Okay, so what we're looking at here is a definition of conflict, and not surprisingly, different academics and different professionals define conflict differently. So there's kind of, ironically enough, there is a conflict in the field over what exactly do we mean by conflict. So I've shared with you on your screen now a definition for you to consider, and it says conflict is an interaction between at least 2 or more parties that have perceived incompatibilities of interests. So anytime we have 2 parties each pursuing their own interests, and when I pursue my interests, it somehow puts me at odds with your interests, then a conflict is created. So let me try to give you a practical example of this. Let's imagine there's a big sale on at the mall, and you're really anxious to go there and buy a new TV or something like that. And you drive over to the mall, and you notice that the parking lot is really, really busy, and it's really full. So you see a nice prime parking spot close to the front entrance, and just as you're about to pull into it, someone else comes at it from the other direction and tries to pull in. So this, to get a little bit technical here, this is what we would call a resource conflict. There's one resource available, i.e. the parking space, and there are 2 parties, there's myself and the other driver, and it's in my interest to get that prime parking space, but it's also in their interest to get that prime parking space. And so because our interests appear to be incompatible, they appear to be clashing, and there will only be one winner in that particular situation. Either he gets the space and he wins the conflict, so to speak, or I get the parking space and I win the conflict. So you can see how conflicts can sometimes be created by the conditions or the context. In other words, if there had been 2 parking spaces side by side, 2 resources for 2 people, of course there would be no conflict. Or if I was concerned about exercise and I didn't really want the parking space closest to the front door of the mall, I'd be happy to let him have it, and I would drive around and take a further parking space, in which case, again, there's no conflict. So I hope that the idea is coming through there that this is one of the most popular definitions of conflict, but if we break it down a little bit, we see that there has to be at least 2 different parties, and in a lot of cases, I would say actually there can be more than 2 parties, so you need to be aware of that going forward. You might think you know who the main parties are, and as you begin to have a conversation with the 2 main parties, you might realize that there are other people who are also parties to the conflict that perhaps need to be involved. So we've got 2 parties, each of them is pursuing their own self-interest or their own personal interest, and in doing so, when they bump against another party that's pursuing their interest, we can have a perceived incompatibility of interest, which creates the conflict. Okay, so you might be asking yourself then, why does he have this diagram on the right with this funny looking face? And if you look at it one way, the gentleman in the photo is looking directly at us, and if you kind of cover one side of the photo, you can see that it looks like it's a profile shot and he's off looking to the side. So it's an interesting optical illusion, and you might be asking, why is that here? Well, that's here because I want to highlight in this definition of conflict, the word perceived incompatibility. Perceived, of course, is referring to the perception, someone's perception. And we know that everybody in the world who we encounter perceives things very, very differently. So you and I can both be looking at this picture on the right now, and you can see it one way and I can see it a different way. And so the interesting tidbit there is that sometimes we think we have a conflict because it's a perceived incompatibility between us. But if we actually just sit down and talk and maybe share some more information, we'll realize, well, we don't actually have a conflict because it was just a perception of incompatibility, but we actually have many interests in common. So we have to be aware that sometimes our interests truly are at odds or incompatible with other people's interests, and sometimes we just might think they are. So we have to be careful that we don't jump to assumptions and automatically believe we do have a conflict. We have to first of all explore that a little further and see if there is truly an incompatibility. Alright, so moving along here, the next slide is titled Conflict and its Prevention. And there's a number of bullet points around here on this slide that we're going to go over. So, it says the potential for a conflict is always around us. Not surprising, because it's a clash of interest. So in any given time throughout the course of your day, all the way from looking for a parking spot at your school or at the mall, to trying to decide with your friends or co-workers where to go and have lunch, to getting home and talking with your parents or your siblings or your spouse about whose turn it is to do the dishes, the potential incompatibility of interest occurs in all of those situations. So there's the potential for conflict. So as I mentioned before, conflicts can be caused by faulty perceptions. So that's where communication becomes essential. We have to share information. We have to say, you know, are you seeing the situation the same as I'm seeing the situation? If conflict is all around us all the time, then maybe we have to consider the fact that conflict isn't necessarily bad. And if we jump to the next bullet point down, it says conflict, if properly managed, can actually lead to some good outcomes, such as new ideas, greater team bonding, and increased performance. So I'd ask you to take a moment right now, actually, and think to some of the conflicts in your own life that you've been a part of at this point, and think, have you ever, of course you're going to have a couple of conflicts come up in your mind where the outcome was bad or it was uncomfortable, but try to think back to any times you've had a conflict where it was managed in a good way that actually led to some kind of good outcome. So what could happen is, like, if you're at work and you and your co-workers have a conflict, if you have a good leadership and good conflict management skills in the workplace, what might happen is that you might actually come up with some interesting new ideas on how to fix some problems occurring in the workplace. And because you got through that challenge together as a team, you'll have greater team bonding. So the idea here that I want to reinforce is that when you think of conflict, usually what comes to mind is negative conflict, that conflict is a bad thing, that conflict should be avoided. I'm trying to make the point here that conflict can have good outcomes and good consequences if you can help people to manage it properly. So we shouldn't say that conflict is bad, but any violence associated with conflict, of course, is bad. So if we accept these ideas, then the next bullet point down says our overarching goal when we're thinking about preventing conflicts is that we want to prevent or resolve conflicts in order to effectively manage them without the use of violence. So we know that conflicts will emerge, escalate, and then de-escalate in recurring patterns, and we're going to see that when we get to the slide with the life cycle of conflict. And prevention begins with recognizing the signs of early tensions as early as possible, or pardon me, of rising tensions as early as possible. So we want to be aware that there's the potential for a conflict, and we want to try to prevent it from getting worse, leading up to a point of violence. So here's the conflict life cycle that I've been mentioning a couple times up to this point. You can see that it's got two main axes. So on the bottom, there's an arrow running from left to right, and that's the progression of time. And then on the left side on that scale, we've got tensions running from low tensions at the bottom of the arrow to high tensions at the top of the arrow. So what happens then is we've identified, or scholars in the field of conflict resolution have identified at least 5 distinct stages that conflicts will go through. So we have number 1, the emergence. So there are some tensions that appear. And then we have number 2, those tensions get worse, they escalate. Number 3, we have a peak where there's a full-on confrontation, or we might replace the word confrontation with violence. And then after the violent episode, there's a de-escalation of tensions and a stage of stabilization. That's stage 4. And then we've got stage 5, which is really low tensions again, and that's where we would look to prevent the next round of conflict. So you can see that the conflict life cycle from stage 5 onwards appears as a gray hump, and that's because we can predict, in most cases, one-off conflicts are actually quite rare, and it's more common for conflicts to go through a series of escalations and confrontations. And so then we distinguish between preventing conflict in a post-conflict stage. So stage 5, a conflict's occurred and we're saying let's prevent the recurrence of conflict or the next cycle of conflict, versus doing early conflict way back at stage 1. And that's the ideal situation, is that you want to say that the conditions are there for a conflict to occur, and the warning signs are there, and let's tackle it really early on before it has a chance to escalate into a violent confrontation at stage 3. The problem is that most people ignore the warning signs at stage 1. And they think that the conflict will just kind of peter out on its own, or it'll disappear, or maybe I don't want to be bothered with this conflict, or I don't have the skills to handle it correctly. So what happens is that usually there's at least one or more instances where the conflict spikes and hits a stage 3 of violent confrontation several times, and then the warning bells go off, and then people get serious. And then we say, look, this conflict is obviously real, it's a serious one, it's been recurring, what can we do now to prevent the next escalation of this conflict? So we distinguish between taking conflict prevention at stage 5, where we've already been through one violent episode, versus undertaking conflict prevention at stage 1, when the conflict has just emerged. And the general rule of thumb in almost all cases is that it's preferable to monitor and recognize the signs of a conflict very, very early on, so stage 1. And in most cases, there will be some early indicators that a conflict is about to emerge. So one of the metaphors that I like to use is to think of a campfire. And if you're camping and you're going to make a campfire, you need to have a number of key kind of things or ingredients to make the fire. You need to have good dry wood, small kindling wood that ignites easily, and you need to have some paper, and of course you need to have matches. So what happens is that all three of those things have to come together, and a spark has to occur in order for the fire to get lit. And if you can recognize that, this is a metaphor of course, if you can recognize that in your family or in your community or in your workplace, all of the components are there for a fire to occur or a conflict to occur, but we can take really, really, really early preventive efforts by saying, let's remove the match, or let's remove the dry firewood. In other words, let's remove the causes and the conditions that are going to create the conflict. So let me just try to put this in some concrete terms. Let's imagine this is a workplace conflict that you're thinking about. And let's imagine that the management team in the workplace has implemented a new policy, and you recognize that the new policy is going to create new divisions in the company, therefore create a new conflict, and that conflict will likely escalate. So what you can do is you recognize early on that that policy, or the implementation of that policy, is a condition to create a conflict, and it might just take one small thing to have the whole conflict quickly escalate and spiral out of control. And if you can change that policy early on before that happens, or shelve the policy or delay its implementation, then you've effectively removed the conditions for the conflict to occur. You've prevented that conflict because you were alert, you were aware, you were recognizing that there was something, some condition or some context created that was likely going to make a new conflict emerge and escalate. Okay, so hopefully that idea is coming through, that you want to try to ideally prevent conflicts before they even emerge at stage one, by removing the conditions or causes of the conflict. And if that's not possible, or you miss the warning signs, and the conflict escalates, the tensions rise, and then there's a confrontation, then you say, well, let's do prevention at stage 5. Let's try to prevent the next spike of the conflict. The last thing I want to mention before moving on from this particular diagram is that you'll notice that there's no time markers provided here. So the idea being that this could all occur within the matter of minutes, depending on the particular nature of the conflict you're looking at. This could happen this conflict and this whole cycle could occur within a week, within a month, or within a year. So if you think of some of the longest running wars that the world is facing right now, like say for example the war in Syria, you know that it's well over 5 years, approaching 6 or 7 years now, I believe. So the number of violent confrontations in that war are probably almost too numerous to really account for. But this same cycle, if you're looking at family dynamics, this could occur over the course of a weekend. So the idea is that when you go off and you apply this diagram and this thinking to your own work, is you have to consider what the specific time scale is. And similarly for the axis on the left side for tensions, you'll see that I haven't really provided any concrete indicators of rising tensions. And again, if you're looking at a war situation, the indicators that the tensions are getting worse are going to be different from the indicators of rising tensions, say for example in a workplace. So you have to take this diagram, modify it to your own situation. Okay, so carrying on then with that thought about the signs of rising tensions, here are some concrete examples I can share with you. They're not really context specific, so to speak, but they're just concrete examples of signs of rising tension. So first of all, if someone communicates an intent towards violence, in other words, they're making threats, then you can say, okay, this conflict is clearly becoming more intense. It's escalating. So if you think about two co-workers, if you know that there's a problem between John and Sue in the office, and you're aware there's a conflict between them and you can't remove the conditions, and you're trying to figure out what stage is the conflict at, and then one of them starts making death threats against the other one, well, clearly now this is escalating very quickly. Also, arming oneself or otherwise preparing for violence is another clear indicator that the tensions are rising and that we're approaching the stage of violent confrontation. Fortifying boundaries and or digging in, that's again another preparation for violence. An increase in hateful language, and interestingly enough, cutting communications. So sometimes we see this especially in the realm of international relations and world politics and international war, where two countries, they may have a diplomatic spat, or they might have a conflict between them, and as the conflict between the two countries intensifies, what they may end up doing is closing down their embassies in each other's countries and withdrawing their ambassadors and closing down the embassies. And in other words, they're cutting off official diplomatic communications, which rather ironically enough is almost the exact opposite thing that you would like to do in a crisis situation, or in a situation of a rising conflict, an escalating conflict, because it's exactly at that point when more communication would probably be better, and good, clear communication would probably be better. So in some ways, cutting communications from a conflict management and a conflict prevention perspective is not very helpful. It's not a good tactic. However, that's definitely a sign that if the parties are no longer willing to engage and communicate with one another, that their tensions are escalating and the conflict is worsening. And I would say that's probably holds in most any context, be it a family mediation where the parents perhaps are separating, the husband and the wife, and if they refuse to communicate, clearly conflict management is going to be more difficult, and clearly it's a sign that the conflict is now becoming more severe. Okay, well, let's move on here. So hopefully that gave you a little bit of a taste of some conflict dynamics. I mean, clearly we could spend a lot more time on this. You could spend probably a whole week or more talking about the causes of conflicts and how they escalate and so on and so forth. But I just wanted to give you some general concepts or some notions to begin with, thinking that we now know a definition of conflict, and we know that conflicts will go through different cycles of escalation and so on and so forth, and that our goal is to try to prevent them early on if we can. So now I want to shift from that to 9 golden rules for conflict prevention. So what do we actually do to help prevent these conflicts from escalating? So number 1, we know that conflicts are inevitable, but every conflict represents an opportunity for a positive, win-win, non-violent solution to be reached. So the first step is that we must recognize this opportunity and then choose to take that path. This applies both to conflicts at the personal level, and I would add here to the community level, and also in the international realm. In other words, we need people to be peace leaders. So it's easy to slip into the thinking that we have a conflict here, this conflict is bad and it's going to get worse and the outcome is going to be bad, and to slip into some very negative, what we might call win-lose thinking. There'll be one winner and one loser. But if we can reframe our thinking and our approach and recognize that conflicts, if managed properly without violence, are an opportunity for growth and development and positive changes, and that we have to steer the parties down that path. So they require someone to be a peace leader and indicate that that's a possibility and that this is a desirable path that you can and probably should take. Because of course the win-lose path creates one winner and one loser, and that doesn't leave everybody happy. So be a peace leader. Number 2, the overarching approach to conflict prevention is to remove the motive, the means, and the opportunity for the conflict to escalate into violence. So I've already mentioned that conflicts are often caused by the context or structural conditions, and I use the example of the parking space, and I've used the example of the lighting a campfire. And the idea is then, if we want to prevent violence, or we want to prevent this conflict from becoming a violent conflict, what can we do to remove the motive? In other words, what's driving one or more of the parties to pursue the violent option? And can we somehow give them an incentive to not use violence? So that's one kind of tactic you can take. Secondly, the means to use violence. Let's go back to a workplace example. So let's imagine then that you're the HR manager, and it's come to your attention that there's the conflict between, who did we say it was, Jane and Bill. So Jane and Bill have a conflict, and we're very concerned about the safety of each of them, but also everyone else in our office. Well, if I'm in charge of that kind of thinking, I'm going to make this a weapons-free zone. There's going to be no weapons allowed in this office building. So we're removing the means for them to wage violence, to inflict violence upon one another. Now, of course, some are going to argue that, you can never, if you take away their weapons, that they will revert to using their fists or using things in the office as weapons, and so that's a valid concern. But the idea here is that if we remove the motive and they no longer want to inflict violence upon one another, then violent conflict arguably won't occur. If we can't remove the motive, but let's at least remove the means so that they can't actually inflict violence or severe violence on each other. And the third and final kind of strategy or tactic is to reduce the opportunities for that conflict to escalate into violence. So when you look at the news and you see UN peacekeepers with their blue helmets patrolling the demilitarized zone between two warring parties, that's exactly the logic there. The logic is, if we can put a third party in between the two parties that are at war or that are fighting, and separate them, physically separate them, increase the distance between them, then the opportunity for them to actually inflict violence on each other has gone down. So I would say that your number one priority should try to remove the motive. What's fueling this conflict? What's fueling the grievance? What's making one person so angry that they want to inflict violence on the other party? If we can't address the motive, then let's at least reduce the means and opportunities for them to be violent. So here are 3 distinct tactics that you can apply in different contexts, from the family to the international level, to prevent violent conflict. Address the motive, the means, and the opportunities. And I should note that I've done quite a bit of training in the past with police officers, and this is one of the things that I teach them, specifically about the opportunities. And I say, if you approach 2 neighbors, maybe you get called to a neighborhood dispute, You know, if you approach two neighbors who are fighting over the location of a fence between their properties, one of the first things you should do is, you know, ask them to each return to their own homes, or at least to their front porch, and increase the physical space between them. And by doing that, you're reducing the opportunity for them to attack each other. So physical separation is one way to reduce the opportunities for the conflict to escalate. So that's golden rule number 2. Think of the motive, the means, and the opportunities. Number 3, be alert and responsive to the signs of rising tensions. Don't ignore them or hope they'll go away on their own. So I've already kind of mentioned that, but it seems to be human nature that when there are signs of a problem and the signs first come up, and you can think of this maybe like with your own car, might be a good example. Imagine you're driving your car and you hear some kind of funny, you know, knocking noise from the front left tire. And you go, well, that's odd. I don't know what's causing that, but I'm just going to pretend I didn't hear that and keep driving. And then by the end of that day, you know, there's a really serious noise when you go to turn the corner coming from that tire, and you take your car to the mechanic, and the mechanic says, well, look, you've got a very serious issue here that's now going to cost you several $1,000s, and if you would have brought this in a lot sooner, you know, we could have fixed your car for $100 and you could have prevented all these problems. And so it's the same kind of thinking that we often will be aware that there is a problem and there are signs of rising tensions or a conflict, and a conflict that's increasing, and that it's only after it's really gotten really serious that we say, whoops, we probably should have done something about this sooner. We probably should have addressed this a week ago or a month ago, or had Bill and Jane in our office for a sit down, you know, before they had gotten a fist fight at the water cooler. So to be an effective practitioner aiming to prevent conflicts, be alert to the signs of rising tensions and responsive to them. When you see they are there, take actions, take the appropriate actions. Okay, golden rule number 4. Put your own personal safety first. If violence is imminent, disengage immediately and take protective measures. What is the saying when you fly on the airplane and they're telling you about the mask that dropped down from the ceiling in case of a loss of pressure? They say put your own mask on before helping others. This is kind of the same thinking. You're not going to be a very effective conflict resolution practitioner or a very effective brave one if you are injured or hurt or are unable to assist the parties. So definitely consider your own safety. Number 5, reflect first and then respond. Don't just react. Stop, count to 4, be present and mindful. This slows the exchange down and assists with the de-escalation. So what I'm talking about here is that in many cases, people have scripts that they run off of, or patterns that they follow, or ways of interacting with their co-workers or their family or whatnot that creates a conflict. And to prevent those conflicts, instead of just automatically spinning off quickly into rising tensions and the conflict getting worse, is that we're trying to interrupt that cycle. We're trying to slow it down. And one way to do that is to not necessarily just respond the first thing that comes into your mind, but to pause and think first and say, well, is my response or is my action here going to contribute to the escalation of this conflict? And is there a different way for me to approach this? Golden rule number 6, consider possible future scenarios, or what we might call conflict trajectories, from the mundane to the seemingly impossible, and our preferred outcome for each one, and be prepared for all possibilities. So in other words, you might recognize that there is a conflict, the signs are there, and you might help the parties to take some actions to de-escalate that conflict. But you have to be realistic and say, well, you know, there's a small chance that my actions with the parties are actually going to make things worse, and this conflict's going to spike really quickly, and that's one possibility. And if that happens, then what am I going to do? How am I going to assist the parties? Or, you know, maybe this conflict, the actions, the agreement that they've reached today, maybe that means the parties haven't really addressed all of the causes of the conflict enough to make it go away for good and forever, but we bought a little time, and I've got them into an agreement where you know, at least they're not going to be at each other's throats this week or this weekend or this whole month, but eventually there's a real possibility that this conflict will re-emerge and escalate quickly. And so if I'm the conflict manager, what can I do, well aware of that fact? What happens if that's the trajectory that this conflict takes? What will be my steps to help prevent that from occurring? So be aware that we don't necessarily know which direction the conflict's going to go in. We don't know if it's going to escalate. We don't know if it's going to escalate slowly or quickly. We don't know if it's going to go away forever necessarily. And that all of these different conflict trajectories or different scenarios are possible, and that myself as a conflict manager has to consider what are the most likely scenarios and what will I do in each scenario. Okay? Number 7. Establish a set of agreed upon facts between all of the parties. Let me try to put this in real terms for you again. Let's go back to that scenario where there's two neighbors arguing over the placement of their fence on their property line. And so we now know that the cause of that particular conflict is a lack of information. We know that the incompatibility between them is that each has an interest to maximize their own yard by pushing the fence as close to the other person's property line as possible. We know that they're so angry over this conflict that it's very likely that they've already had a fist fight, and now we know that one of them has weapons and they're threatening their neighbors with death threats and so on and so forth. So the possibility of real violent confrontation is there, and it's serious. So one way to help prevent that conflict from escalating and becoming a violent confrontation is to say, I understand that both of you gentlemen are in a dispute over the fence and where the fence should be located, and I understand both of you don't want the fence coming onto your own property, so you don't want your neighbor's fence on your side of the property line. Would this conflict be resolved? So this is really addressing the motive for it as a side note. Would this conflict be resolved if you two could agree where the property line is, if we had a precise location? And I would presume that both of them would say yep. Then I would say, well, look it, the only way we can all stand around here guessing where the property line might be, the only way to resolve this with any amount of certainty is to have an outside professional survey company come in with their professional GPS equipment and whatever else they may use to locate the property line for us and to clearly mark it. Do you guys agree that would be a good way forward to help manage this conflict? And I bet they would both say yes. Okay, well, let's look at the costs of that then. How about the two of you agree to splitting the cost 50-50 of having the professional surveyor? Okay, so there you go. That was, of course, a fictional example of how establishing a set of agreed upon facts between the parties can prevent the conflict from escalating. And that's just one example. You can probably think of others. The only side note, and I don't want to go too far off track here, the only side note that I need to mention is that as a mediator, you have to be very, very careful about suggesting solutions to the parties And in that little fictional example I just gave, it was very much the conflict manager was trying to direct the solution or direct the outcome. And ideally, you would hope that the parties might reach that same thinking or reach that same conclusion of their own accord. And you could help them along a little bit and give them some hints, but you really can't be imposing your own solution onto the parties. And really it has to come from their own thinking and their own problem solving. So that's just a side note, a caution there. But I just gave that example to really just to help illustrate this point, that if we want to address the motive of the conflict or the reason why people are fighting or what the reason why the conflict is occurring, we've talked about one thing is to improve communication. Another thing here is to establish some agreed upon facts. And if the facts are out there and both of them agree to the facts, then we can have the conflict maybe be resolved or prevented, if you will, and have it not escalate into something more violent. Golden rule number 8. Never be certain that what you think you know is complete or right. Nothing is certain until it is certain. So again, this kind of speaks to the optical illusion slide from earlier in this conversation, where you can have 5 different parties in a conflict in the room, and each of those 5 different parties are going to disagree on what the conflict's really over, and you are going to have your own kind of analysis or diagnosis of what the conflict's all about as well. And so that's 6 people in the room now. So there's 6 different people with 6 different opinions about what they think the conflict is about and how it could possibly be resolved. So as a professional, brave one, conflict manager helping other parties to resolve their conflicts, you have to be careful about your own assumptions and your own understandings, and you can't jump to conclusions. And you can kind of fact check in a way what you know or what you think you know by asking the parties. So imagine that they're on the platform, and perhaps you've invited both parties to give an opening statement about what they feel the conflict is over. So party 1 talks for about 15 minutes on the platform, and then party 2 talks for about 15 minutes, and then you're starting to formulate your own opinion, and so you reflect that back to them and you say, if I understand this correctly, are you saying this conflict is primarily over the financial issues? I've heard you talk about several issues today of concern in your opening statements, but it seems to me that the financial issue is the key one or the central one. And so you just kind of bounce that back at the parties and you look for a validation or a confirmation. And what you might find, and maybe in your own mind you think that it's really a money matter, and money is important to so many people at the end of the day. And what you might find is that they both say, well, no, you know what, this has nothing to do whatsoever with the money. This has to do with the way that I was treated last week and the way I've been treated ever since I started working here. And I'm not concerned about the raise or the promotion or getting a bonus. Or the money is not that important. What's important to me is a matter of principle, the matter of fairness, and getting an apology for the way I was treated. So as a brave conflict manager, if you heard both parties give their opening statement and you thought, this conflict's all about the money, and we can sort that out, help them sort it out pretty easily, you would be leading the parties then down a track that doesn't necessarily prevent the main conflict. So you might resolve the money issue, but the conflict still won't go away because you haven't addressed the main issue fueling the conflict. So you have to be careful about your own assumptions, thinking that you are certain about what's going on and how things can be resolved easily. So number 8, never be certain that that what you think you know is complete or right. Number 9. This goes back to the establishing of the agreed upon facts, but help assist the parties to identify very specific actions that will reduce or resolve the conflict based upon the agreed upon facts. So let me go back to my fictional example of the two neighbors fighting over their property line. Imagine in that conversation it surfaces that yes, indeed, the main issue that needs to be resolved is the location of the property line. So you can easily leave it at that and kind of walk away from the situation and say, well, congratulations, you guys, you spent an hour here on the platform and you sorted it out. But ideally, you want them to take or to commit to some very specific follow-up steps or concrete actions. So you can say, you know, I'm proud of you guys for working through this situation today, and I'm thrilled that you've concluded that if we knew precisely where the property line is, this conflict would be resolved and any future conflicts around this are prevented. Now, let's take this to the next step. Let's create an agreement that has very concrete actions. And so there is built into the platform an agreement function where you can click on the left side and there's a template that pops up. And at that stage too, it's helpful to remind the parties that some agreements are binding. In other words, once you agree to it, you'll be held accountable to it. And other agreements are non-binding. In other words, there's really no consequence for not following through on your commitments to the agreement. So that's an issue that we could talk about perhaps in another training session. But for now, I just want you to keep in mind that kind of the natural conclusion of the whole conversation is that you want them to get to the stage of creating ideally a written agreement using the function on the platform, the agreement function, that has very specific concrete actions. So you could even get very specific and say, you know, we had this session on Thursday night, so Monday morning, Bill will phone, you know, some survey companies for estimates or quotes. By Thursday morning, he will share all of those written quotes with the other party. Both parties agree by, you know, Friday afternoon to select. So you're specifying who is doing what, and you're putting in very specific timelines too, like day by day, who's doing what. Okay, so that's number 9. Get down into some very specific actions that will reduce or resolve the conflict. Okay, so I've alluded to this a few times, and now I want to change our focus and drill down on communication. Communication is interesting because communication or a lack of communication can be a major cause of a conflict. And so communication or improving the communication thus becomes the key to its resolution. So the more that you can practice good communication skills and assist the parties to be better communicators, the likelihood that they will resolve their conflict should increase. So, good communication, why is it the key to resolution? Well, there are at least 4 or 5 reasons provided here. 1, good communication, if they start having a good dialogue, it can help to build up the trust between the two parties. Secondly, good communication can help correct any misperceptions. Thirdly, it can increase understanding. And fourth, the task of generating solutions really only comes about through communication. So that last step I just mentioned, step 9, packaging up an agreement with very specific actions, coming up with the actions and the solutions in the next step, that involves talking back and forth. Well, what do we have to do? What are the steps we have to take, and who's going to do them? So communication builds trust, corrects misperceptions, increases understanding and helps to generate solutions. So we need to be aware then that communication is both verbal and nonverbal, and one estimate of this says that the verbal communication, in other words, what's actually said, is only 10% of the message's meaning, and 90% of communication is embedded in nonverbal things, such as body language, facial expressions, and so on and so forth. So that's depicted in this pie chart on the right side of the screen. But we also have to be aware that communication is a cyclical process. In other words, it goes back and forth, involving speaking, listening, understanding, and then responding. So not surprisingly, because there's so many steps in the communication process, there are many spots for this cycle to break down. Communication is subjective. It's influenced by the culture and the context. So think about, maybe you've had the opportunity to travel overseas to a different country and experience life in a different culture. Think of some of the different ways that different cultures communicate, and the different gestures, and how different gestures mean different things in different countries. So if you're doing cross-cultural communication, it can be more difficult, because the way the words I use make sense to me, but they may not make sense to you, or they might mean different things in your culture. It's subjective because of the context. So context distortions are possible, i.e. noise in the system can distort the message or slow its transmission. So think of the difference between having a Skype call. Well, no, let's go to the example of let's imagine you're working on the Brāv platform, and one of your parties is in a cafe or a coffee shop, and there's music playing in the background, and there's customers, and there's other conversations. Whatever they say, then their message is going to get distorted, because there's all this other noise going on around them. And if the other party, on the other hand, has their laptop in their home office, and it's a nice quiet office, they've got the TV's not on in the background, there's less noise in the system, therefore their message will be more clearly communicated and more clearly understood. So you have to be aware of that then when working on the Brāv platform, that you might want to ask the parties to make sure that when the session occurs, that they ensure that they're in a private and quiet room without any disruptions or interruptions and other ambient noise, and that will assist in the communication process. Communication is determined in part by the method of transmitting the message, i.e. the medium that the message flows through. So again, if you're working on the Brāv platform, you're predominantly working with a web camera and a microphone, and if one of the parties chooses to mask their face, some of the non-verbal expression will be lost. So you need to be aware of that. And if you, of course, if you were a mediator in a face-to-face setting where you could see the person's whole body posture, are they slouching, do they have their arms crossed and they look closed off, and you can read more. So you have to be aware that communication is going to be determined whether you're it'll be determined by the method of transmitting the message, and a webcam will be very different from an in-person training. So here's that communication process that I was just mentioning, that cyclical process depicted visually. So we've got a woman on the left here who's the message transmitter, or what they call here the sender. So she has to come up with a message in her brain and encode it, and based on her past experiences and her attitudes and her skills and her perceptions, so a whole bunch of psychological factors will determine how well she can formulate and send her message. Then she sends her message through the air. In this particular example, it looks like a face-to-face meeting, and there might be noise in the system that disrupts the message, so there's some coworkers up there. And then the gentleman in the right He's the receiver of the message, so he has to be able to hear the message. He has to be able to decode it and understand it. And that's partially determined by his own experiences, his attitudes, his skills, and his perceptions. And I would add to that perhaps his cultural background. And then in order to close the loop, he needs to send a message back to her saying, okay, I hear what you're saying. What you're saying is the money is not a problem, but you really need an apology. And then in the middle, it just says that the message or the medium it can be verbal or nonverbal, written messages as in a Word document, email, web, or pictures. So different mediums, like I just mentioned on my last slide, will affect the quality and style of the communication and its ease in being sent or encoded and decoded. So on the notion of communication, sometimes there can be a rush, maybe on the opening statement where a person comes in, they've got a lot on their mind, they have to do a lot of kind of throat clearing, they might have to do some posturing, and they may take 15 or 20 minutes for their opening statement just to air out their grievances and get everything out on the table, and they just want to spew a lot of information. And I would say the general rule of thumb is that you want to go slow to go fast. So that might sound counterintuitive, but there is a lot to be said for slowing the conversation or the interaction down. And I've already alluded to this in a previous slide where I noted that you don't want to go into autopilot. You don't want to respond and react immediately. And you can hear what the other person has said, and you can pause, and you can use some silence, and you can take some deep breaths, and you can really think through what is the best way for me to react or to respond to what has just been said. And so by slowing down, what happens is we can have a deeper and more meaningful conversation that gets to the very core of the problem, rather than a more superficial discussion that overlooks the root causes. So if party one lays out kind of 10 major grievances, and party two, including some of those grievances, are framed as a personal attack on the other party, and party two just automatically replies to all of the 10 personal attacks on them, then the communication is not really helping to resolve or prevent the conflict from getting any worse, because we're just dealing with the superficial level of personal attacks and the back and forth. And you really need to pause and say, well, what's at the core of this? What are the key issues? And then let's drill down and really talk about each of those issues and talk about them in depth and really resolve them. So go slow to go fast to improve communication. Seek to understand and clarify assumptions. I've already talked about the danger of this. So shift your attitude to one of curiosity. So instead of approaching the session from the perspective of I know what's going on here, I know the solution, etc., etc., you can shift your attitude to I'm not sure what I'm going to hear today, so this will be interesting. And I'll see if it confirms or denies my own thinking about the situation. So have a curious attitude. Ask a lot of questions. So a key for communication is to ask questions. It helps put the other person in a listening mode. And when a person is really concentrating on listening, it can reduce their physiological arousal, which can help to de-escalate a tense situation. And through asking lots of questions, we know that important new info can surface as well. And I would almost be tempted to add a third bullet point to this, where I would say by asking lots of questions, we help to clarify our understanding of the situation. And I've alluded to that in a previous slide as well. Okay, so after you ask all of those questions, then you have to Listen, listen, listen. And so there's a saying, of course, that we have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. And it's because we need to pay. A lot of us have that ratio backwards, where we want to be speaking all the time and we don't like to be listening. Or when we're listening, we're not really listening to the other person. We're actually daydreaming or thinking about how we'll reply, or thinking about taking a mental holiday and thinking about, you know, what we're going to have for dinner tonight. So the art of active listening, and this is a skill that can be just like learning to golf really well. It's a skill that can be taught, and it can be learned, and you can practice it and continue to perfect it. And it's quite difficult, I would add. And I would encourage you going forth from this point forward to try to be an active listener, and try to just be there as a non-judgmental, open listener. And so listening requires that we give the other person our full and undivided attention, and we aren't simply waiting for our turn to talk, or we're not taking a mental vacation, as I just mentioned before. Use minimal encouragers to keep the forward momentum of the conversation going and to affirm that you are listening. So minimal encouragers are small words like yes, uh-huh, right, okay. And those small words, they don't break up the flow or interrupt the other person, but they just show the other person that you are there, you're attentive, you're paying attention, and you're following along. Okay, so thinking back to the circle or the cyclical communication process I showed you a few slides ago, one aspect of being a good communicator is to complete the circle. In other words, you want to close the feedback loop by paraphrasing what you heard. And this helps to establish the facts. So, in conclusion, each of us has the ability to help prevent and resolve the everyday conflicts we face. It isn't always easy to do, but with practice of the application of the tips presented here, hopefully you'll achieve some great results. And if you like this one, don't forget to sign up for the other. There's a typo there. That should be 3 webinars in my series. And now, on to the quiz. So like I mentioned at the very start of this session, this webinar, there is a quiz that you have to complete. So there are 3 parts to the quiz here that we'll go over. And then you need to email your completed quiz to Brāv at nextgenerationmediation@gmail.com. And upon successful completion of the quiz and review of the quiz, and once your registration fees for this webinar have been received, you can add this to your Brāv 1 profile. Alright, so for the quiz, what do you have to do? Well, I want you to think of a conflict that you might be helping to manage on the Brāv platform. And you're welcome to pick a real-life conflict or to make up something. But I want you to list 3 specific signs or indicators that the conflict is getting worse. So imagine, yes, that you are... whoop, I didn't mean to do that. Oh dear. Bear with me 1 second here. Right. So imagine then that you're a Brāv 1 working on the Brāv platform, and you're listening to 2 of the parties talk about one of their conflicts. What are 3 specific signs that might happen during that session that would lead you to believe that this conflict is actually getting worse? So I'm not going to give you any clues right now, but if you think back to some of the things we talked about earlier in this video, there's some clues there. Okay, second thing, list 2 ways that you can help create open communication between the parties on the Brāv platform. Again, I'm not going to give you any clues there, but if you think back to the talk earlier in this video, There are some specific things that you could possibly do to help create open communication. Thirdly, describe how you would convey to the parties that you are an interested and active listener. So there you have it. Like I promised, nothing too scary or onerous. Thank you for participating in this video webinar. I hope you enjoyed this session, and this concludes our session, and I hope you will join me for other sessions as well. So thank you, and take care.